right, here we go. I cannot get the lighting quite right, so, but you're not going to see me for very long, so I think it'll all be fine. Yeah, I'm looking at myself now, and I look funny. But hey, it's midnight, and we're about to talk about slavery, so that'll be great. I hope you're enjoying getting to see this video. I'm at a very fine hotel for some meetings, and I'm sure everyone nearby is wishing they could hear me a little louder as I talk about history. So, and for some reason, my computer is magically healed now. I have no idea why. And now I can open Word. So it's been quite a day for me. Yeah, it's good. All right, let's go ahead and get started because I know you don't want to hear that I can open Word. You don't care. All right. The good news about me talking to you at midnight is it's probably not going to last for 2 hours, is it? So there you go. All right, so we're in chapter 11, and during this era, they often referred to slavery as the peculiar institution, which is why you have that title for this chapter, but they're talking about slavery. And we've talked about slavery many times already. It kind of comes up in the early part of US history, pretty much throughout the entire part of early US history. So now we have another chapter kind of devoted to it. And the reason for this is you start to see an abolition movement that develops during this time period. You're starting to see more and more conflict related to how we let new states in. And this almost exclusively has to do with slavery. I know tariff policy, but it's mostly about slavery. So there you go. All right. Southern economy, we've already mentioned, once cotton becomes a really important crop internationally, the South is going to supply anywhere from 80 to 90% of the world's cotton. So it becomes a really important cash crop. And even though there are going to be people who suggest pretty strongly it would be good for the Southern economy if the farmers diversified a bit, they're not going to because they make so much money. And I suppose that makes a little bit of sense because, you know, if what you're doing seems to be working, you don't necessarily think long term, will this be working in, you know, a couple of years? You just think, oh, this is working great now. And when it stops working, we'll pivot then. But as there become more and more calls for people in the South to consider ending slavery because it might be immoral, something along those lines, you're going to start to see a greater defense of the institution of slavery. I think before there was just an assumption like, yeah, we're going to have slavery. We don't really need to defend it. Now that there's starting to be more vocal argument against it, you're going to start to see a more definitive argument that supports the idea of slavery as a positive good, which I know must seem fairly odd to you. It does to me as well. But in the time period, yeah, I don't know. They dug their heels in for sure. All right. So less diverse economy. Cotton is a source, Southern cotton is a source for textile mills in the US, England, and France. And they're making more exporting it than they are in the United States. Now, as the United States becomes a more important manufacturing nation, really post-Civil War, things are going to pick up, and that'll be, you know, a deal for the South since they're going to lose their overseas markets. All right, so the divide between the northern and southern economy is going to expand as the northern economy becomes more diverse and the southern economy becomes really dependent on single crop agriculture, primarily cotton. And, you know, again, the North does have an agricultural component to its economy. They tend to grow most of the food in the United States. I'm not saying they don't grow some food in the South, but it tends not to be a cash crop. So in the North, the food is a cash crop. There are other cash crops as well, but, you know, the food for people, but also the food for animals as well. So the South is going to start to talk about how slavery is probably a better institution in a lot of ways than hiring immigrant laborers because the factory system in the North exploits immigrant labor And in the South, you have a paternalistic slave system that takes care of workers until the day they die, whether they can work or not. So they're really, doing a fine thing for the slaves and their families, even when they're no longer productive. And that's not exactly true if you've read a lot of slave narratives, because a lot of times they free the slaves those last few years they're alive, and then they go live in the woods until they die. And other slaves will go and like sneak food and things to them. It's not uncommon. Frederick Douglass will talk about that in the narrative of the life, but certainly it's not an uncommon story, and you hear it in other slave narratives as well. All right. The North is going to note the crass viciousness of slave labor, that certainly slaves are abused, female slaves are raped, male and female slaves are beaten, occasionally killed. You'll see works of literature like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which apparently is very loosely based on a true story. But one of the two things you will see about both the North and the South, they really want to demonize the other side, but they really don't want to fix their own. And that's probably not a huge shock, is it? While the Southern defense of slavery develops in response to economic and politically motivated criticisms of slavery, you do start to see a very serious, legitimate, politically backed call for abolition to end slavery. And some of that does come out of the Second Great Awakening. I know I've said that before because I really do want you to not think that everything that comes out of a church is terrible, because we tend to think that historically. I blame the Catholic Church, but not Catholics, and just in the Holy Roman Empire region era, because the Catholic Church in the modern era has, I know there's some bad things, but has done some nice things as well. But anyway, we'll keep going. All right, Cotton Kingdom moves farther west. We talked about that development because of the cotton gin. So the region of the country where cotton is a cash crop goes all the way to Texas. So kind of circles around the bottom part of the South. That was a great geographic direction there for you. And this is going to become essentially the most important source of income. The book will also talk about how the Upper South is going to start selling their extra slaves from the tobacco growing regions, the Chesapeake, Virginia, and Maryland. They'll start selling their extra slaves to the South, and that becomes an important source of income for them as well. And you'll see a class system develop in the South that really links people not completely by economics, but more by racial prestige. And it's one of the things that really convinces poor Southern whites that they really should support wealthy slave owners, no matter what. And you'll see that that's a fairly effective technique. Southerners will promote the slave system as paternalistic, more humane than wage labor, because you care for the older slaves even when they can no longer work, which is, it's not always true. Planters refer to slaves as if they are people, and they see them as members of their extended family. At least that's how they talk about them. However, if that's how you treat your extended family, I don't want to be in your family. But they do talk about them as though they're eternal children, essentially, that slaves wouldn't be able to take care of themselves without the help of their masters, that they wouldn't be able to manage a farm, they wouldn't know what decisions to make. Poor whites are not always going to agree with the planter class, but when the North really pushes down on the South and says, you guys are immoral, your way of life is terrible, it needs to be changed, the yeoman farmer class, the poor farmer class, is going to support the wealthy farmer class. And the wealthy farmer class, plantation owner class, is not a very large percentage of the Southern population, maybe 5%. It's not a very large percent at all. And you'll notice that there's some statistics in this chapter that talk about what percentage of people in the South own slaves. And most of the people in the South who own slaves own one or two slaves. The majority of the slaves are owned by a tiny minority of the population in the South who are plantation owners. And those guys also control the government because that's what rich people do. They have free time, so they control the government. Yeah, the rest of us, we got to work. Yeah, look at me working at midnight. Some of you are working at midnight too. So I know you don't feel sorry for me. That's all right. That's fine. I didn't really want you to, but I don't have time to be a congressman, and neither do you. So wealthy people do, and that was true back then as well. All right. Um, all right. Frederick Douglass. I mentioned Frederick Douglass a lot because he's kind of important. Frederick Douglass is author of a slave narrative called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It's, very well titled. He escaped slavery and learned how to read while he was a slave, kind of in a sneaky way. He talks about it in the book. And he equates education with freedom. He says there is no freedom without education. So he doesn't understand anybody that doesn't want to get education when it's available. I mean, he had to sneak around to get it. So his owner's wife taught him how to read, and then the owner found out and said, don't do that anymore. And so then he tricked all the little white kids on the plantation out of their books and to help him learn to read and stuff like that. Kind of an interesting story. But it's a tragic story as well because his goal in writing the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is to show a true to life slave narrative by somebody who's fairly well known and seen as an educated fellow. So it's supposed to add some credibility to his story, but he's also going to tell it like it is. I mean, one of the opening parts of the book talks about one of his earliest memories is watching it's either his mother or his aunt get beaten, and it is a brutally honest, rough story. And he'll also write this open letter. There's a link to it in the notes as well, to a former slave owner asking how any supposedly Christian man could treat his mother and treat his aunt and his sisters the way that they were treated. And he's going to describe in detail what happened to them, their beatings, their rapes, that sort of thing. And people will look at that letter and they will say that it's improper for him to talk about those things in a public forum, which is fascinating because they won't say that it's improper for Southerners to perform those heinous acts. So Douglass will also write the very famous What is the 4th of July to a Slave, and talk about the incompatibility or I guess, contradiction is a better word, between the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and the continued existence of slavery. So Frederick Douglass, as you're gathering, is an abolitionist, and part of his paid job during this era is to go around speaking about abolition. Yeah. So he's going to be a paid speaker, and he'll get some government jobs later on too. He's going to be an advisor to Abraham Lincoln, which is fairly interesting stuff. And he'd been a laborer before, and he'd also his slave owner got upset with him because he wasn't terribly obedient. That's not an ideal position, I think, to be in as a slave. So they hired someone to break him. What's essentially supposed to happen is somebody comes in and beats him up, and then he's submissive after that. And he ends up beating up the guy that was supposed to beat him up. And then the slave owner's just like, I don't even know what to do with this guy. But they saw him as an investment. So they rented him out to work in docks in Baltimore on the docks. And that's where he ends up buying some fake freedom papers and escaping. But he doesn't talk about how he does it in the book because, slavery's still going on and other people are doing that. There's some other things written about slavery during this era that are probably important for you to be aware of. There's a book from a guy named Hinton Helper. He's from Alabama. And the book is called The Impending Crisis of the South. And this book talks about how slavery is bad economically for poor white people in the South. And this is seen as a really dangerous book because it's written by a Southerner. So you have a Southerner, a working class Southerner who doesn't own a plantation, who's talking to other working class Southerners and is saying, this institution is not good for you. No matter how much you're going to support it, it's not good for you. And he tracks the economics of it and shows what jobs are more likely to be available if slavery ends and how it will enhance them economically. And this book is banned in many places in the South. There were stories of people being arrested or lynched, the book being burned. So this book is a book that people in the South fear. This book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is a book that really stirs up people in the North and stirs up working class people in England. That'll be important later because the South is going to try to get England to support them in the Civil War because they buy all their cotton, and England buys their cotton, and the South wants to buy the manufactured goods with lower tariffs. So it seems like an economic match made in heaven. But because the working class of England, so many of them had read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they felt like, oh my gosh, we as laborers are treated a lot like this. So they felt sympathetic to that character, like they had something in common with that character. Yeah, the wealthy class in England was not going to risk a revolution by the working class or an uprising of any sort to support the South, which was unlikely to win this war anyway, without some foreign help, which they're not going to get. But Uncle Tom's Cabin's probably the more famous of, the three books that I've mentioned to you. Uncle Tom's Cabin's written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher's father, Lyman Beecher, is a very famous preacher from the time period, part of the Second Great Awakening. Sorry for the yawn. And her sister's Catherine Beecher. You'll hear about her a little bit more as we move along. She has some unusual opinions about the role of women in society, or maybe not unusual for the time period. But Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom is a slave, and he's essentially perfect. He's a Christ figure. If you've read a lot of, I don't know, do they talk about that in a literature class? But if there's a character in the book who's perfect, they sometimes call them a Christ figure, and he's actually going to save somebody's life. He'll end up getting beaten to death unfairly without saying anything against it. So it's his crucifixion essentially. So, but Uncle Tom is, obedient, submissive, saves the master's daughter from drowning, just a perfect sort of guy, but eventually is beaten to death by the slave owner. Also, I know that you've probably heard colloquialism, slang, I suppose, of people sometimes referring to African Americans in the present era who they believe give in too much as Uncle Toms. And if you hear somebody say that, that is not a compliment. So when I taught high school, I would also say, like, this is not something you get to say to anyone. So, and if you hear somebody say that, be prepared for someone to be really upset or maybe to ask, what did that mean? Um, but Uncle Tom's Cabin sells hundreds of thousands of copies internationally, and it really is kind of a call to the movement for abolition in the North. In the South, they just think, well, that's just some stupid Northerner that doesn't know anything about slavery. So we really don't care what she has to say. She's just expressing her ignorance. So in the South, they're more concerned about this book. In the North, they're more likely to read this book. And then abolitionists also. This is more of a popular novel, and this is, I'm sorry, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is going to be read by really committed abolitionists and lots of students who are required to read it. If you ever just have some free time and want to read something really important from this era, I think that's it. I really do. You can typically find this online. I know you're thinking in my free time, I'm going to read the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. But I don't know, my older brother who makes cheese for a living, and I talk a lot about how he's probably the most important intellectual of the 19th century, and he's very rarely discussed in US history classes. He's a brilliant self-taught fellow, and reading some of the stuff, any of the stuff that he wrote, even if all you read is what is the fourth. That's an impressive work as well. And it's short. So you wouldn't have to read, 200 pages or so. But think about it. You have time for that. Plus, it's almost the 4th of July. Yeah. All right. Back to business. So criticism, of Hinton Helper taken more seriously by Southerners because it was offered by another Southerner. Harriet Beecher Stowe, just a Northern woman who doesn't know what she's talking about. Her novel argues that slavery is immoral and unchristian. Best example of Christianity in the book is Uncle Tom, who's eventually beaten to death by the slave master. Novel inspired readers in the North and working class folks in England. I feel like I just said all that, so I won't say it anymore. Northern criticism of slavery unified different socioeconomic classes in the South to defend slavery, and we've talked about that as well. Probably the two most prominent defenders of slavery and the paternalistic nature of slavery, or even the idea of slavery as a positive good, are these fellows, George Fitzhugh and John C. Calhoun. You might remember John Calhoun as Andrew Jackson's vice president briefly until the South Carolina rebellion against the Tariff of Abominations, the 1828 tariff. And John Calhoun is going to argue that states have the right to nullify federal law when they see that it's wrong. And he's going to argue pretty famously about the positive good of slavery. You definitely need caffeine after midnight. All right, so when they argue the positive good of slavery, they're going to talk about the brutality of wage labor in the North and how universal liberty is not natural. Yeah, that's not ever happened in history. We have slaves all throughout recorded history. Nothing unusual here, nothing to see. Plus, in the North, the slave owners take such good care of their slaves. They're well fed. They're considered kind of an extended part of the family. They're treated, like children, that sort of thing, taken care of, provided for in their old age. And of course, all of this is either exaggerated or untrue. But the idea of having slavery throughout history, certainly, there's slavery throughout recorded history. What is different about this type of slavery, and we've talked about it before, is that it is generational. So you're a slave, your kids are slaves, your grandkids are slaves. It's not once a debt is paid off, and there's no way to earn your freedom. So it's an enormous change, the hereditary slavery. So, but these folks are going to argue that slaves are better treated than wage workers in the North, and they're going to bring out examples of wage workers in the North being poorly treated. Again, part of the reason Frederick Douglass writes his slave narrative, and you'll see lots of other slave narratives in this era. Slaves are free from economic cares, had easier lives than people who work for a living. And the founding fathers, who initially saw slavery as a necessary evil that needed to be changed over time, they were clearly proven wrong, according at least to Fitzhugh, Fitzhugh, he's defending slavery, of course. And we also have clearly decided by this era that the idea that all men are created equal and entitled to liberty was a false notion as well, because there are certainly people we didn't agree were entitled to liberty. We removed groups of people west of the Mississippi. We still enslaved people. We weren't really sure that women were capable intellectually. So this idea of all people created equal, entitled to liberty, has really been proven as a falsehood, according to Fitzhugh and Calhoun. And your book will talk about those guys a little bit. And it follows that same idea that you'll read about in the DeBow article for your document analysis, which honestly we'll talk about more in class on Thursday. I don't know that 12:30 or 1 o'clock at night in the morning is the best time for me to go over that. So yeah, we'll talk about that later, I promise. Slaves are entitled, and plus I know you're going like, it's really straightforward. It is really straightforward. You're not. Slaves are entitled to some rights. Um, sort of, not really, kind of. There's certainly laws protecting slaves, but if slaves have to go to court, only white people can testify on their behalf. So you would have to get white people to testify on your behalf that something that happened to you was criminal in nature and worthy of prosecution. Um, Slaves can't sign legal documents unless white people witness and serve as their guardians. After 1830, Nat Turner's rebellion, I think that's really 31, but around that time is when it becomes illegal to teach slaves to read in almost every state. Certainly after the Turner Rebellion, it is. Slaves do have some freedom of assembly as granted by their owners, usually on Sundays where maybe they can go to church or go visit some relatives on local nearby plantations, that sort of thing. Um, but there were actually some court cases regarding slaves and if they had the right to defend themselves. Probably the most famous court case is about a Missouri slave named Celia, and Celia was a young woman. I don't even know that you would consider her a woman, but remember they have shorter lifespans back then. So she's 14-ish. She's a young teen, and her her master pretty regularly raped the female slaves to, either show power over them or produce extra slaves. Honestly, probably both. And so he told her she was old enough now that she was going to be next. She had no interest in being next. So when he would come to the slave quarters at night, she would hide. She'd go hide in the woods or something. And he told her during the day, I'm coming tonight, and if you're not there, I'm going to take it out on one of your family members. So you just need to suck it up and be there. So she stayed in her sleeping quarters behind the door with an iron. And in those days, they called it an iron because it was made of iron. So he comes in and she pops him in the head with the iron and he dies. So she gets charged with murder, and she is able to find white witnesses who will go and testify on her behalf that this fellow had very publicly said that he was coming to rape her. She was protecting herself from that rape, and everyone in the jury believed her, and they convicted her of murder and executed her. Now, she was pregnant. They allowed her to give birth to the baby so that the master's family could have their slave, and then they executed her. And if you're wondering, like, why would they say that it was murder? They said because she's a slave, she doesn't have the right to protect herself against rape, that she just has to submit to that. So even though there are some laws that say that slaves can protect themselves, in practice, it's not going to happen. Now, it's very common during this time period for people in the South who were devout Christians to use stories from the Bible to defend slavery. Now, that document that you're using for the document analysis this week, that's primarily what it is. It talks about who does it talk about owning slaves? It talks about Abraham owning slaves. It talks about, it talks several times about Abraham owning slaves. It talks about Levitical law that discusses how slaves can be treated, if they can be punished, that sort of thing. Talks about how Joseph was sold into slavery. And then it mentions it in the New Testament as well, that there are certain epistles, those letters, you have the first four books are called Gospels, and they're the story of Jesus' life. And then the rest of the books are letters from people who followed Jesus to churches from the time period. Well, in many of those letters, they talk about how slaves should submit to their masters the way that Christians submit to God. And they also caution slave owners to treat their slaves well. And there's an entire chapter in the New Testament, Philemon, or a book in the New Testament with that's about a slave. So the people who use this to justify slavery say, look, the Bible wouldn't talk about slavery if it weren't okay. Now, some things that I would suggest as not a theologian, but a little more of a historian than a theologian, but still, anytime you're going to use your religious text to justify something that other people are arguing is wrong, you typically are not going to use the entirety of your religious text, the parts where it says, love your neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself, that sort of thing. And the story is in the Bible, the parables about who's your neighbor, the Good Samaritan. That guy was from an ethnic group that was looked down upon and seen as lesser, but he's the one who actually helped people. So, point of the story is, not only love your neighbor, but also don't be racist in the process. So, you can overlook some stuff if you're in the mood to overlook some stuff. But I would also suggest to you that people who are writing in the New Testament really believe that the second coming of Christ is imminent. It's going to happen really, really soon. So they're not looking to fix stuff on earth. They just want to make sure that everybody's ready for the afterlife as quickly as possible. And that's kind of it. So their goal isn't the Bible's not a book about social reform. It's a religious text. So, but anyway, here's some stories. Oh, and I linked some stuff in here if you want to read more about this. My guess is, you don't have time, you've got other stuff to read, but you never know. Okay. Stories in the Bible that are often told, retold during this time period who support slavery. Cain and Abel, kind of an early one. You may know the story of Adam and Eve. They're the first people. Eve apparently made from Adam's rib, and they get, they like each other a lot. Somehow babies are produced, and two of their sons are Cain and Abel, who don't get along well. Clearly, this is after somebody has sinned and we have the fall of mankind. The people are fighting, otherwise brothers would never have fought. But Cain and Abel have to follow the same system everybody else. Everybody else, there's like 5 people. But the other folks on earth followed during this time period to present sacrifices to God at regular time periods, essentially to ask for forgiveness. And I always get these wrong, but Cain is a hunter and Abel grows crops. So Abel brings the first fruits of his harvest, the best stuff. And God goes, hey, thanks a lot, Abel. And then Cain brings like a limp, spotted goat or something. So he brings some animal that's not acceptable, that's not of the highest quality. So God rejects Cain's sacrifice. And that makes Cain really mad. And he goes like, you hated my sacrifice, but you loved my brothers. And so his reaction is he goes and kills his brother. And then God comes to visit Cain. He says, hey, where's your brother? And Cain says, what am I? My brother's keeper. And then God says, well, I know you murdered him because I'm God. And so you're going to get punished for that. And then Cain says, other people will harm me if I go throughout the earth because they know that you're mad at me. And so there's supposed to be a mark placed on Cain to warn people not to harass him. And it's not, none of this is good theology. I will say that up front. I can't imagine there's anybody who's really studied the Bible who thinks that any of this stuff is true, accurate, good interpretation. But people said that the mark of Cain was that God made him black. It's like, oh gosh, yes, they did say that. All right. Next Bible story, you also find out today why they don't let me teach Sunday school at my church. This fellow named Noah, you probably heard of him. He built an ark. I guess it had never rained before. And God said, build a giant boat. And he goes, why? And God says, just do it. I'm God. So, he builds the ark. He's got 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And, I always think that we should bring back those names. People should name their kids Ham, Shem, and Japheth. My parents named their sons Jim, Jeff, and Josh. Ham, Shem, and Japheth would have been better. But at any rate, um, these guys, you know, they're all on the boat with their spouses and lots of animals, apparently. And then, you know, they start civilization over. God got mad at people because they didn't serve him. So he just drowned everybody except for Noah and his family and some animals. So then they're starting over again. They get off the ark, they're hanging out, and apparently Noah thinks he's got grape juice because who would get drunk on purpose? And but instead he had wine and he drank too much. And the next morning, his kids were looking for him, and Ham finds his dad in the tent. So he goes like, "Where's Dad? Where's Dad?" And then he goes in the tent. It's like, Dad's on the ground and he's drunk and naked. So then Ham goes back and tells Shem and Japheth, Dad's drunk and naked. And then Shem and Jeff go, Japheth, I named him after my brother. Japheth go, oh my, Dad is drunk and naked. How do we preserve his dignity? So apparently they walk in backwards, don't ask me how or why, and drop a blanket over him. And then Noah wakes up and he goes, man, I must have been drunk and naked. And then he goes out and gets the story, finds out Ham made fun of him. And in Old Testament tradition, I think tradition from that time period, at a certain point in your life, parents, your dad, pronounces upon you a curse or a blessing. And you know that Shem and Japheth get the blessing because they didn't make fun of their drunk and naked dad, and Ham gets the curse. And in his curse, his descendants will populate Africa and they will be destined to serve their brother's descendants. So there you go. All right. Again, did I mention none of this is good theology? Yeah, I probably did mention that. Abraham, father of uh, God's chosen people, um, and Islam as well, or maybe that is God's chosen people. You get to decide these things. But the father of God's chosen people also owned slaves. So how bad could it be, right? And New Testament, it shows up. So Jesus never directly condemned slavery. The Apostle Paul suggests that slaves should serve their masters, um, as though, not although. Who types this stuff? Oh my goodness, who's in charge of these notes? As though they were serving God. And you see that as a consistent theme in the New Testament. And of course, that whole book of Philemon is Philemon is an epistle, a letter. I can't spell. I can't. Yeah, I shouldn't be typing it. Whatever time it is a letter about a slave. And that's a whole book in the New Testament. It's a really short one, but yeah, if you ever have to pick a book in the New Testament to read for some reason, pick Philemon. It's really short. Uh-oh. Did I just lose light? Did I just lose power? What the heck? Crud. These hotels downtown, they're not safe. Okay. Um, yeah, and then you've got the story of Egypt and Israel being enslaved by Egypt. And yeah, but Israel's God's chosen people. And if you compare slavery to God's chosen people being enslaved, I don't know if that works for the analogy, but they're going to do it. Also, you'll notice, maybe you'll notice, slave songs and slave stories, slave sermons on enslaved churches tend to talk about enslaved Americans as Israel being soon to be delivered out of Egypt. Yeah, so they, you know, the slaves themselves will adopt this analogy and they're fine with it. Western folks see themselves as God's new chosen race. You see that a lot with discussions of manifest destiny. It's also why it's okay to kick Native Americans off their land because they are not God's chosen people. Although, yeah, no, there's, well, anyway. White Western folks are the modern God's chosen people, according to white Western folks. I know that not everybody's going to believe that. And I'm thinking in the modern era, pretty much nobody believes that. Slaves embrace Bible stories of freedom, retribution, like Israel escaping slavery in Egypt, David defeating Goliath, Samson defeating the Philistines, Daniel in the lion's den, the idea of Joseph being enslaved and then becoming the emperor of the country. Emperor, is that the right word? But one of the leaders of the country. and just the general concept of eternal justice. And not uncommon for religious people during this time period to think that sometimes justice doesn't come during your lifetime, that that's something that comes in eternity. All right, if you're wondering why there weren't more slave rebellions during this time period, dang, maybe have I gone too quickly through this stuff? If you're wondering why there weren't more slave rebellions during this era, well, it's because not a lot of slaves had guns. So people with guns tend to win if there's a fight, and there's not going to be any legal support for slaves who rebel, and when they get caught, they're going to die. Most people don't want to die, so the most common forms of rebellion are things like Frederick Douglass you can just run away. Certainly, you see Harriet Tubman, Underground Railroad, that sort of thing. You see people escape. And if you can go north, Canada is the place to go. Massachusetts at times is the place to go as well. And lots of religious people help on the Underground Railroad. You see especially Quakers, and who else do you see? Mennonites and the Congregationalist, former Puritan kind of groups. You see religious folks helping, having safe houses for people on these railroads. And the railroad isn't necessarily a literal railroad, although they might occasionally use some literal railroads or tunnels or things like that. It's typically one of those things where you travel at night and then you sleep during the day. And, you get signals either. I went to some museum with my former college roommate at spring break, and it was a quilt museum. Oh my goodness. She's from Iowa. She likes to do quilting. And I found out at the quilt museum, and I don't know why I didn't know this, the people in the quilt museum were very upset with me because I didn't have very good quilt history. I really don't. But they were distressed that I didn't know that lots of quilters used their quilts as signals on the Underground Railroad. I really did not know that. And they were upset with me. And they didn't think I could be a real history teacher because I didn't know that. I really did upset a bunch of old gals. So, oops. But there were lots of people who helped, but it's got to be a secret thing because it's illegal. Helping slaves to escape. Let's see. If you lived in the Southeast, you could go hang out in Florida with the Seminoles. That would not be an unusual thing. It's why if you see tribal pictures in modern era, you'll notice like, hey, those guys look African American. Yeah, there's a reason, because a lot of escaped slaves went to join the Seminole tribe. And there you could go west as well. Potentially, it's just there's not a lot of places settled in the West. Um, yeah, the upper South slaves, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, probably you're going to escape to the north. The Southeast, you probably would go to Florida. There are some slave rebellions, Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, which we mentioned in passing in 1800, Denmark-Vesey conspiracy in 1822. Both of these are really discovered before they're enacted. And Nat Turner's rebellion, Virginia, 1831, is enacted before it's discovered. And it seems like around 100 folks are killed in the rebellion. Turner's objective was to go through Virginia, throughout the South, from plantation to plantation, and kill the slave families and free the slaves. And if you see newspaper accounts from the time period, people are just incensed that Nat Turner and his rebels would kill innocent women and children. Now, nobody seems incensed that slave owners would harm innocent women and children, not that I'm in favor of killing folks or, anything at all. But I mean, you can understand it if you're trying to escape. They were trying to point out the brutality of the slave system and escape. They get caught and they get executed. Nat Turner was a freed slave who was allowed to work as a preacher and preached on plantations in Virginia and helped organize rebels on each of these plantations. So after Turner's Rebellion is when you really see a crackdown on education for African Americans, for freed slaves. And you'll also start to see Southern states banning um, freed slaves from living in their states. I know we talked about that already with the Missouri Compromise. You'll start to see Southern states pass those laws as well, because their assumption is nothing good comes from free Blacks living in a state that allows slavery. You know, what ends up happening is slave rebellions. So, but after Turner's Rebellion, you see a crackdown on teaching slaves to read, allowing free Blacks to live near plantations, and the sort of freedom of movement that slaves sometimes had on the weekends, you know, when their work was done, where they could go visit other plantations pretty readily. That's going to change, you know, after Turner's Rebellion. Now, these open rebellions are pretty unusual because if you lose, you die. And it's also unusual for people who are married or have children, coupled or have children, to be rebellious in this way, because the punishment or the harm could go to their families. So the people that you see most likely to escape are young men. And some of that's, you know, probably true as well, because younger folks are faster, and more fit, that sort of thing. So, you know, you can escape better. And I say this as an older person. If I have to run, it's an unusual thing. I probably told you, I had a pit bull in my neighborhood chase me the other day when I went to get the mail. In that instance, I will, yep, I'll run, absolutely. But, you know, as a rule, I'm walking quickly instead of running. But slaves that are going to escape tended to be younger, more fit people who are not attached to a family. They're old enough that they're, you know, they may have been sold away from their family. Um, Most of the time when you see slave resistance, it's the day-to-day stuff, silent sabotage, your book will talk about it. It's really like a working slowdown. So, you know, people don't work as quickly as they're supposed to. Maybe they sabotage the equipment they're supposed to be using. Sometimes you'll read about slaves who poisoned the family's water supply or the food, that sort of thing. But you see more of these covert activities, work slow down, you know, breaking stuff, that kind of thing. So that is a more typical form of slave resistance during that era, because it's harder to prove and harder to punish. All right. And Underground Railroad, Pathway to Freedom for Thousands. Um, um, and we usually associate Harriet Tubman with that. And I think, you know, that they were supposed to redo the $20 bill, and Harriet Tubman was supposed to be on it. And then the Treasury slowed that down, and that's supposed to happen again. So that'll be interesting if that does. All right. So your question, I really did go through that quickly, didn't I? But I guess when you start at midnight, you go through stuff a little faster. And we will talk about this again on Thursday. I promise, I promise, I promise. And this goes so nicely with your document thing that I really think, you know, if you end up doing this question, you're going to be in, you know, you'll know what to do on this. So for the most part, white Southerners defended the peculiar institution, whether or not they had slaves, whether they were rich or poor, whether they lived on large plantations or small farms. Why was this the case? And of course, you know, I'm not going to lie to you, I did not bring my book with me, so I don't have page numbers for you. But if you look at the headings, and we may talk about page numbers on Thursday, but I don't know that I need to tell you. Do I need to tell you? But if you look in the book, the subject headings will tell you where to look. So when it pretty much this is the whole chapter. I wouldn't expect your answer to be 30 pages long. So pick some examples of that the book lists about why or when people defended slavery. Feel free to talk about the biblical defense if you like. Talk about how the Southerners would band together. There's sort of a caste system that's based on racial prestige. So even if they were unlikely to ever own slaves, they still are going to defend ownership of slaves. And in part two, I know I'm scrolling, sorry. In part two, it's because when the South really is strongly challenged by the North, they really do go on the defensive. So if you look in the section where it talks about the books that are written, that's also where it starts to talk about the defense of slavery. So you can talk about the reaction to the books. You can talk about Southerners kind of banding together under racial issues rather than socioeconomic issues. Talk about Fitzhugh and Calhoun as defenders of the positive good or paternalism regarding slavery. Feel free to talk about some of the biblical arguments as well. But the question isn't completely about how they defend it, but it's as much about why it's also about why they defend it. And a lot of that is going to do with defending themselves from what they feel are unfair political and economic attacks from the North. And they also are going to justify it potentially with those arguments and saying, we treat slaves, we, the South, even though most people in the South didn't own slaves, we treat slaves better than people in the North treat immigrants. That's what you're going to see. All right, I'm going to stop sharing this for a second. And maybe I can find it. I won't take long, I promise, because it's really late, isn't it? See if I can find the, dang it. I thought I only did this when you were here, but no, I'm doing it now as well. Let me see if I can find the document that has the study stuff. Okay. It's telling me I need to save something. So 3 notes, poop. It's so late. I'm like this when it's early though. I'm probably smarter when it's late, to be fair. All right, ACC, somewhere, there we go. Unit 3. I don't see it. Okay, one more try and then I'm giving up. I know, it's so late. We'll go with the spring. It's probably in the spring thing. So 1301 unit 3. I know, right? You guys are going, is it over yet? It's almost over, I promise. I think it's because my eyes are so tired at this point. Questions, weekly questions, quiz. Oh no, that's the whole quiz. Do I want to show that? I know you're going like, she should. Oh, all right. It says I can't open that. That is really rude. How dare they say I can't open that? Incredibly rude. All right, don't they know how late it is? All right, let me open it really quick. I know the lighting in here is really weird. I had another light on and it was so bright that you couldn't see my face. I don't know that you need to see my face, but there it is. All right. So your review stuff for this, pretty basic stuff. Oh, crud, I didn't talk about the Amistad. I'll talk about that really quick. Frederick Douglass, Slaves and Liberty, King Cotton, the idea that the economic pull of cotton really controlled the politics of the South as well. The second middle passage is the route. I think it's the route from the upper South to the northern, or to the lower South. The importance of New Orleans for trade. Also, one of the things that happens in New Orleans as well is you're more likely to see free Blacks in that city and people of mixed race heritage. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, perhaps. Andrew Johnson, Common Man in the Slaveocracy. Andrew Johnson is going to be a senator from Tennessee. Later on, he'll be vice president and president. And his thought is that, and he'll express it exactly this way, that every family in the United States should own a slave to relieve the drudgery of daily life. He grew up, his father died when he was young, and his mom could not afford to keep both of his brother and him at home. So he had to essentially rent them out as apprentices, which wasn't uncommon for the way poor kids learned a trade when they didn't have a dad. So not an unusual thing, but he really resented it because, he eventually married a wealthier woman and hung out with wealthier people and thought they were super snobby, and thought that the problem really was not that we had slavery, but that not everybody had a slave. And that would be a way to even out income in the South if everyone had a slave. Um, so yeah, he's going to be the guy who's president after Abraham Lincoln. That'll be perfect, won't it? Right after the Civil War, he's definitely coming up later. And the idea of Andrew Johnson, the common man, the idea that the average person in the South is as good as a slave owner. And if they became a slave owner, they just wouldn't be a cotton snob, but that the slaveocracy potentially controls the government. And um, you'll see that kind of develop into the northern version of the slave power, but we'll talk about that later. That shows up in another chapter. So yeah, why are we talking about that at 1 at night? No, we're not doing that. We talked quite a bit about the planter class and paternalism. The idea of the code of honor is that Southerners are willing to defend their honor, their heritage in a much more physical way, say, than Northerners tend to. For whatever reason, that sort of code develops and is seen as more acceptable in the South than it is in the North. Um, at least that's what I wasn't around back then, but you certainly see that written about pretty commonly during this time period. And Southerners will just see Northerners as lazy and chicken, and Northerners will see Southerners as violent and ignorant. So isn't that nice? Fitzhugh and others, Calhoun, make the pro-slavery arguments and biblical arguments. Slave life, slave codes are limits on the liberties that slaves have on the weekend, where they can go, who they can be accompanied by, eventually whether they can learn to read, that sort of stuff. Slave family, slave culture, there's a section about that in the book. And what it talks about primarily is that because slaves don't really have control over who gets to be in their family, because, women get raped, children, adolescents get sold away. You may have a marriage and then one of the people in the marriage gets sold or harmed or something like that. That slave family is kind of who you're with, and that they're very open about accepting new people. And they understand that this is a transitory relationship as well. And slave culture and religion tend to combine whatever African elements may still be around with Christianity, not an uncommon thing at all. And slave sermons really tend to focus on stories about people escaping slavery, Israel being freed from Egypt, Joseph escaping slavery, that sort of thing. And we've already talked about slave resistance, Harriet Tubman, Underground Railroad. The Amistad, this is a slave vessel that runs aground in, I think it's Rhode Island. I don't know why. I know, I can't remember. But it runs aground in Rhode Island. It's a Spanish vessel long before this time period. This is 1830s, I think, late 1830s. Long before this time period, the slave trade's illegal in the United States, and even longer ago, it was illegal for the Spanish to trade slaves. I mean, that happens pretty shortly after De las Casas. So these guys are breaking all kinds of laws, pretty much everywhere they could break laws. But that's also a sign to you that the slave trade was still continuing, especially through Cuba and into Latin America, and some into the United States, but it was really more of a Caribbean or South American kind of thing. Well, the slaves on the ship had come from Sierra Leone, and they were able to overtake and kill most of the crew. They kept the captain and the navigator. They said, take us back home. They instead went north, ran aground in the United States, and claimed that these guys had murdered people. They are able to find some people who work on the docks who speak similar language, and they're able to find out what happened. And their case goes to the Supreme Court because, it's international folks arguing points of US law. So the Supreme Court would have original jurisdiction. That means you go directly to the Supreme Court. You don't get referred there. And the lawyer who argues on their behalf is John Quincy Adams. Yes, John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams is going to argue on their behalf, argue successfully, and the Supreme Court is going to say, yeah, you should be freed, and the United States government should pay your way back to Africa, which the United States government did. Yeah. And then you've got the Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner Rebellion. It's so late. I was thinking Ike Turner. Do you know Ike and Tina Turner? No, Nat Turner Rebellion. Oh my goodness, it is late. All right, there are probably a million other things I could say, but I'm not going to because I gotta go to sleep. All right, hopefully this lecture did not put you to sleep. Hopefully it was helpful. We will definitely talk some more about this on Thursday when I will actually be in class. I appreciate your willingness to watch this amazing video with the great lighting in a hotel room. So hope you guys have a good day. Thanks for tuning in. Feel free to just put a little thumbs up or something in the comments, but if you don't, I'm honestly going to assume you watched this. So don't feel like you have to, but I will look kind of to see how many views there were, but I won't give you too hard of a time. All right, thank you guys so much. Have a good morning, afternoon, whenever you're looking at this, and I will see you sort of kind of on Thursday. Thanks a lot.